Greetings from Paris. Jeff, what did you think of our visit to the European Investment Bank earlier this week?
I actually really liked it. I was looking forward to it, but I had a great time. I learned a lot about European investment banking, which I didn't know a lot about before.
And what did you think about the structured finance aspect of the investment bank? Did you find that interesting?
That question is coming from a finance major here, so she expects a legitimate answer coming from me. But I did like the structure and how they only invest in things expecting other people to invest based off their investment, kind of.
Right. I was surprised by the bank's lack of equity capital markets, but I was very interested to know that they have a lot of project finance, specifically things like roads, bridges, infrastructure, things that will improve the entire European Union. Ari, do you have anything to add to this?
I really appreciated how they were all about the startups and innovation, but I think it's interesting how they kind of decide what's going to be a good investment and what won't be, and how they evaluate the different startups.
I also thought it was interesting that when the European Investment Bank decides to invest in a project, it automatically attracts other investors to the project as well, because you know that it's a legitimate project.
Right. So didn't they only invest, or don't they only invest about 50% in something, and they expect other investors to contribute the rest?
Right, and then they expect other investors to contribute the rest. All right, thanks everybody.
So Maddie, we were in 2 different groups for the trip and had different breakout sessions. So was there anything that really stuck out to you in your meetings?
Yeah, I definitely had a really great meeting for my finance and banking class. We talked about some of the different regulations that banks within the European Union have had to implement. The man that we met with talked mainly about commercial banks, so he wasn't talking about institutional investors. He was talking about, people like you and me that go to a savings bank and put our deposits with that bank. He said that, in the wake of the financial crisis, these banks are facing not necessarily problems, but just some new challenges because they have a lot of different regulation to implement, like one of which would be increased capital requirements. So these banks need to make sure that they have enough capital so that, if a lot of deposits are taken out at one time, these banks are able to pay out all of their depositors. They also have to have increased liquidity ratio requirements. So basically just like safety nets to make sure that that what happened in the 2008 crisis doesn't happen again. Then, I think even more interestingly, we talked a little bit about European Central Bank policy. So, as we know, right now, the European Central Bank has put in very, very low interest rates, and it's hoping that these low interest rates for, banks to borrow from one another.
Meine Freunds.
Jack. So anyways, continuing, European Central Bank policy is right now to have interest rates very low, and the purpose of this is to increase borrowing and spending within the European Union and stimulate the economy. But unfortunately, what we're seeing is that even though these interest rates are so low, people are still unwilling to invest because trust in the economy is lost. And even though Mario Draghi is setting the interest rates very low, people just don't have faith that the economy is going to recover and that they're going to be able to make a return on their investment. Additionally, if we look at the divide between Northern and Southern Europe, these really low interest rates actually benefit Northern Europe more because people are now looking for basically any way that they can to get a return on their investment. So one of the first investment options that they look for is government debt or government bonds, and people are more willing to invest in Northern European government bonds rather than Southern European government bonds because obviously Northern European government bonds would be safer than Southern. So these interest rates and the central bank policy benefits some European countries and actually it detracts from the economies of others.
I think it's really interesting, going back to what you were saying on how the people are scared to invest, because I know we touched on this a little bit, but when we had our meeting at the bank, they were talking about how a big part of Europe's economy right now is all about innovation, and to get people to invest in new innovators, the government has to invest first. And if people are already scared to invest, I wonder how this might affect this whole innovation project and how that could long-term affect the future of Europe and how it is in the technology world and other aspects.
Yeah, I think that the European Investment Bank definitely has its work cut out for it right now. But then again, the projects that the European Investment Bank chooses to take on are probably going to be some of the best returns in the entire year, or going to give some of the best returns in the entire European economy right now.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Okay.
Hi, I'm Jeffrey Truitt, and I'm going to talk a little bit about one of our break-off sessions, although it was only partially a break-off session because all of Group B, I believe, pretty much everybody that was an econ and business major went to this. It's the European Investment Bank in Luxembourg, which we were in the ad for a couple of hours. Olivia Saunders spoke. She's a civil societies officer, and she talked just a little bit generally about what the European Investment Bank is, what it does. She reiterated what we already know, which is that it was created in 1958 with the signing of the Treaty of Rome, and it's technically an EU institution, although they're not civil servants and they're not financed off the community budget, which I found interesting because they're financed off the capital market, which is different than other EU institutions that we know. Apparently 10% of what they do is outside of the European Union, so they not only invest in Europe itself, they invest outside in things like Africa, the US, emerging markets, etc. There are 4 key priorities she mentioned that they have. One is infrastructure, the next is small and medium-sized enterprises, which they help businesses at every stage of development, not only at the very beginning, they just the whole way. And the third one is the environment, which is a key priority for every EU institution these days, but especially for the investment bank. Also, innovation. The European Investment Bank maintains an S&P AAA rating, which is pretty impressive and is why they can finance low interest loans, which is highly marketable for them. Cheap borrowing and lending for them. They do lending as well as blending, which are their products, as she said. And back to the AAA rating, the US doesn't even have a AAA rating anymore, so that is a very good thing. And that's my little spiel about the European Investment Bank.
Okay, Ari, why don't you tell me about one of your course-related meetings?
So, I don't know, one of my favorite meetings, surprisingly, was the talk that I had with a Politico writer. So his name was Nicolas Van Keur. He was born in America, grew up there, but then came to France and started working for Politico France. And he talked a lot to us about how the media kind of influences politics and kind of takes polarized views on an issue rather than kind of showing the truth on how people feel about something. So, for example, we talked a little bit about the migration crisis and the Paris attacks, and how right now the media is really depicting France in a turmoil and the people super against migration and incredibly racist. And in reality, he said it's not like that. And 2 days after the Paris attacks, because he was there and did an article on it, people were really scared and timid, and there was a lot of police presence. But he said within 2 weeks after them, the police presence dwindled. People went back to their normal day-to-day lives. However, the media across the world made it seem like Paris was feeling under attack, and I don't know, it was really interesting to kind of see how our views are so shaped by what the media puts out for us. And again, he was a writer for a news magazine, so he's not going to be totally against the media. And he suggested that when you want to get informed on politics, it's really important to take on as many different article views as you can. So I guess I kind of took it as in America, when I'm reading about what's going on in an election, I should check out Fox News, which tends to be pretty Republican or leaning towards the right, but then also go to CNN, which is notorious for being a little more to the left, and then find a couple other articles in between to really shape my opinion. because although news articles tend to be biased, he said that it's not necessarily just the media's fault, but also the public's fault, because we're looking for those interesting stories that are really cutting edge and super dramatic. And he said a lot of times what's going on in the world isn't as dramatic as it's being depicted, but it's what we want to read. And another point that he really made is that all of the different news agencies out there are kind of competing with each other to have the most interesting headline. And he said, if you're not going to be the first news outlet to report an article, then you have to have the most interesting title to get those clicks, because nowadays the news is really all online. So you see that these news companies are just competing against each other to get your attention and not so much trying to convey what's really going on out there. And I don't know, it's definitely going to be interesting to see how the media goes on into the future. But yeah, I don't know. Are you a news reader?
Yeah, I think it's definitely really important to get your news from multiple sources. We see the same effect in the United States all the time, because people are, looking for the information that they want to hear. And news outlets also have a responsibility to make profits, just like every other corporation. So
something really cool, just going off of that, is that he also said how like the U.S. is actually leaps and bounds ahead in conveying news than any other country in the world,
which is surprising,
and how Americans are actually the most open to hearing different points of views. And I feel like we're always so critical of ourselves in the U.S. So hearing that from a totally different point of view in France was pretty interesting.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Jeff Truitt. I'm going to talk briefly about the speaker, Wojciech Talko, the Polish guy, who spoke to us about TTIP. And he's the Directorate General for Trade, or one of them, I should say. And little something about TTIP. It stands for the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, which is an up-and-coming thing that Europe has been working on for a while. He was obviously very pro-TTIP, didn't really offer any negatives about it. And one quote he said regarding why it's taking so long is the easy things with America were done a long time ago, referencing like the easy negotiations were done a long time ago. So then the negotiations are naturally going to be much longer. Just briefly, I'll mention the pillars he talked about of TTIP is 1, market access, 2, regulatory cooperation, and 3, rules for trade.
So Ari, what did you think about our meeting with the representative from the EU Council?
I thought it was really interesting to see how Brexit is being dealt with on more of a government level, not so much the whole public opinion. It was definitely pretty cool getting a full document that was handed to all of the UK officials on the guidelines and prerequisites for what would happen if they leave the EU, or what would happen if they stay with the EU.
Yeah, I totally agree. That was a really long document, and those lawyers definitely have their work cut out for them. I think it seems obvious that Britain is going to stay in the European Union, and that most of its citizens realize that that's the most intelligent choice. As David Cameron announced the referendum on June 23rd, the pound actually fell against the dollar because the markets anticipate that, if Britain was to leave the European Union, there would actually be negative consequences for Britain's economy. So I think that, that really speaks to any argument that Brexit supporters would have. Britain's economic strength is definitely somewhat dependent on remaining within the European Union.
Yeah, I mean, going off of the whole Brexit conversation we had, I followed that up with my group, and we had a foreign policy discussion. And really, in my opinion, it just seems like Brexit isn't the issue that the EU should be focusing on after receiving that document and all of our migration talks. I think the real issue is everything going on in Syria right now. And personally, I don't think that the UK is really going to be leaving the EU. I mean, we learned about all of the economic losses that they'll suffer, the whole Schengen agreement. I mean, what do you think? Do you think Brexit is the major issue for the EU, or more of what's going on in Syria?
I definitely don't think that Brexit is a major, what the EU should be focusing on right now. I think it actually speaks to the UK's power within the European Union that they can even make this an issue right now, given all the other problems that are facing the European Union. I also think that if the UK were to vote to leave the European Union would have to impose very harsh terms on them, because they would need to discourage other countries from leaving as well. And I don't know.
No, yeah. I mean, I think it's a little concerning, because now either way, I mean, we saw all of the guidelines that the UK wants if they stay in the EU. And if they stay, which I think they ultimately will after like talks that we've had, think about the precedent that it sets for other countries. What's going to stop anyone in the EU from saying, well, we're leaving unless you do this, this, and this?
Right, definitely.
You know, I think either way it's going to set a really bad precedent, and it's going to definitely weaken the EU.
Yeah. Anything else? Nope.
No.
All right.